Hello, I'm Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Welcome to today's National House Call. We are going to give it a moment for folks to join on, and then we'll get started. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's National House Call. As you know, our House campaign focuses on advancing anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale sustained investments and reforms that are needed to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. We launched this campaign in 2021 because we recognize that more than ever, we need bold policies to ensure that people with the lowest incomes and those who are the most marginalized have a stable, affordable, accessible home. So on today's call, we're going to have advocates from across the country, including homeless shelter and service providers, housing advocates, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income people in need of or receiving federal housing assistance, people experiencing homelessness, philanthropy, and media. It's a really broad call, so thank you to everybody for joining. And before we jump into our agenda, I just want to remind everybody that you can introduce yourself in the chat box, and you can ask your questions in the Q&A box. It's a little bit easier for us to follow your questions if you put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions that we can with our speakers today. I also wanted to remind folks that we are going to send everybody a copy of today's PowerPoint, a copy of the recording of the presentation, and any of the materials that our speakers share with us in the coming days, so you'll all have those resources available to you. So why don't we move along to our first speaker? We're going to hear from John Bay from Vera Institute of Justice, who's going to share with us some new information, a new report about how state screening policies for people with conviction histories. John, I will turn it over to you. And thank you, John, for joining us from the heart of an airport right now.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thumbs up. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Great. So hello, everyone. My name is John Bay. I am the program manager for the Opening Doors project at the Vera Institute of Justice. Thanks so much for having me, and I especially want to thank the National Low Income Housing Coalition for including me today. Next slide, please. The Vera Institute of Justice is a national organization that works to improve the criminal, legal, and immigration systems. We envision safe, healthy, and empowered communities and work to end mass incarceration. Opening Doors works to increase housing access for people with conviction histories through policy advocacy, technical assistance, research, and communications. Next slide, please. So I know I may be preaching to the choir here when I say this, but housing is a human right. However, and like we all know, for some marginalized groups, that right is often out of reach. For people with a history of arrest, incarceration, or other involvement in the criminal legal system, there are barriers posed to this foundational need. And because of this, some have to resort to living under a bridge, like we're seeing in this photo. The work that we do seeks to remove those obstacles and to ensure that a person's conviction history will never be a barrier to housing. Next slide, please. So it's unclear how many of the 70 million people with some sort of criminal history face these challenges. However, what is known are the impacts of these barriers. Formerly incarcerated people are 10 times more likely to be unhoused than the general public, with 203 out of every 10,000 formerly incarcerated people having experienced homelessness. Those who are homeless are 11 times more likely to interact with law enforcement, and this contributes to this cyclical relationship between homelessness and justice system involvement. Barriers to housing for people with conviction histories really tears families apart, inhibits economic mobility, and really undermines public safety. Next slide, please. So in light of these issues, policymakers, criminal justice stakeholders, and housing providers are rethinking restrictive housing policies and considering ways to be inclusive of people with conviction histories. Just today, the HUD Secretary announced actions that the agency will be taking to remove some of these barriers. And in other parts of the country, other stakeholders, including state housing finance agencies, I'll be referring to them as HFAs, are considering ways to be inclusive of people with records. HFAs offer financing to make possible the purchase, development, and/or rehabilitation of affordable homes and rental apartments. Among other programs, they administer the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, a federal program that awards tax credits to developers for the construction and rehab of affordable housing. To understand the range of different policies that are inclusive and exclusive of formerly incarcerated people, Vera conducted a scan of all 50 states and DC's Housing Finance Agency policies. The report and other resources can be found on our webpage, or the address to the link is on the slide, and I can also share it with the National Low Income Housing Coalition so that you can do the report. Next slide, please. So, I mean, there's really a range of policies, and we found that 11 state housing finance agencies have some sort of guidance on the use of criminal background checks or criminal backgrounds when making admissions decisions. It can range from, having properties and developers not use arrests or arrest records on the basis to deny someone. Or it can be establishing a look-back period or requiring that an individualized review is implemented if a person has a conviction history. 7 states have agency guidelines or policies that permit explicitly the use of conviction histories to deny people admission to housing. And I think this is also important to note that 34 states and DC have no guidance. But I think, as some of you may know, discretion in this context often means denial. In addition, we kind of covered 6 states that have enacted statewide legislation that sets parameters on housing access for people with conviction histories. Now I'm just going to highlight 2 examples, one from Louisiana and one from Ohio, of kind of changes that were made to be inclusive of people with conviction histories. Next slide, please. So the Louisiana Housing Corporation passed their criminal background screening policy in 2021. It didn't happen kind of, out of thin air. There was a real push from advocates, including the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, Voice of the Experience, and many system-impacted people that really highlighted the changes that were needed to make affordable housing accessible in the state of Louisiana. The new policy at the Louisiana Housing Corporation, stipulates that housing providers who access LHC dollars may not consider arrests, charges that did not result in a conviction, or results from the youth justice system. They apply specific look-back periods for certain types of crimes. They consider reasonable accommodations if convictions were related to a person's disability. And if a person is flagged for having a conviction history, the housing provider must provide applicants an opportunity to provide mitigating evidence for an individualized assessment. Next slide, please. The Ohio Housing Finance Agency also implemented a policy for criminal background screening. OHFA requires that housing providers submit tenant screening procedures for approval. And in this policy, they stipulate that denials cannot be based on arrest records alone. Look-back periods need to be, quote, reasonable. they require individualized assessments and require opportunities for applicants to provide mitigating evidence. What OFA does also is they provide a model criminal background screening policy in their qualified allocation plan. The qualified allocation plan is kind of the guidelines or the criteria that HFAs use to score developers and kind of see if they can be allotted tax credits. So in this model screening policy, they require that housing providers only consider certain types of felony property crimes, certain types of drug offenses, violent offenses, and certain other crimes within the last 5 years. And if the applicant has a conviction that is included in this list, an individualized assessment must be conducted. So I think that kind of closes out my presentation, but I think the biggest takeaway after completing this report is that I think there's so much more that we need to do, and there's an opportunity here to work with an important stakeholder group to make affordable housing accessible for people with conviction histories. In the coming months, we'll be announcing an opportunity for VERA to provide technical assistance to HFAs to change their policies. And I'll make sure to relay that information to this group to see what levers we can pull and how we can collaborate across the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. It's really, really important work. I know that many of us here share your mission to make sure that people who have criminal histories can also access housing. I'm wondering, one of the things I noticed is that there's so many states that don't have state HFAs, that don't have any sort of guidance. I'm wondering, why are states either, I guess it depends which direction they go, but why are they so slow to be addressing this issue? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, so there's no requirement. So we started by looking at the low-income housing tax credit program, and as some of you may know, LIHTC is it's administered by Treasury, so they set the allocation for each state, but the Department of Housing and Urban Development, they set kind of the tenancy or guidelines. Kind of not doing the terminology justice right now. But there isn't any requirement to look outside these parameters and establish an inclusive or an exclusive criminal background screening policy. So much of the policies that we're seeing, especially the inclusive ones, it was really pushed by kind of outside stakeholders. So in Louisiana, it was the Fair Housing Action Center. I believe in North Carolina, there was a group of legal service providers and also housing providers that came together. And so there is this opportunity, and I think there's a lot of coordination that could happen with kind of housing advocates to push HFAs in the right direction.
Yeah, that sort of leads to what I was also thinking. You mentioned 7 states that that explicitly allow for denials. Do you know if there are statewide efforts there to try to roll back that harmful guidance or fix it? What kind of advocacy is happening?
Let's see. So not off the top of my head do I know if that there are advocacy efforts happening. In some states that actually have some more inclusive policies, I know that there's some organizing advocacy happening to look beyond affordable housing and pursue policies and legislation that kind of covers the entire housing market.
You have best practices or guidance to advocates about what sort of screening practices they should be pushing for, and where could they find that?
Yeah, so on our website, we actually have a resource for public housing authorities and kind of the best practices for the policy changes that they could seek. When we first started this work, when Opening Doors first started this work, we targeted the public housing market and worked with public housing authorities to change their policies. We're kind of expanding the reach of our work now. So in terms of best practices, people always want to know, so what is the appropriate number for a look back period, right? Give me the magic number. And, for me, I think it's always the lower or the smaller, the better, right? But one thing I'll say in terms of like best practices is that in the housing context, I think it's often a binary conversation when we're talking about criminal backgrounds, right? So it's like you have a conviction history, you're denied. And there isn't this nuanced conversation that happens that looks at a person holistically. And I think we really need to figure out ways like policies to push for that. And I think one avenue to do so is to advocate for individualized reviews, that if a person is flagged, don't immediately deny them. There shouldn't be a blanket denial, but they should be really given an opportunity to provide evidence of rehabilitation from their conviction or, ties to the community, et cetera.
Yeah, wonderful. I have so many questions for you because it's such a interesting topic and one that's, I think, on top of mind for many people. One of the things you mentioned is that later this summer, HUD is going to be issuing a notice of proposed rulemaking. What sort of opportunity might there be for advocates to engage in that? And also, will you come back and talk to us about that once that proposed rule is out for comment?
Yeah, I think so. That was just announced this morning. Kind of the action plan that HUD is going to take to have HUD programs and policies more inclusive for people with conviction histories. So when the notice of proposed rulemaking goes out, I think if we can come together as advocates to offer comments, right, and to offer comments and feedback through official channels, so that the policies that we would like to see in our communities are actually implemented at the agency level.
Wonderful. And since this report is focused on state HFAs, state housing finance agencies, there is a trade association, the National Council of State Housing Agencies, NCSHA. Do you know if they put out any sort of recommendations to their HFAs, or is that another place where advocates can encourage best practices?
Possibly. I'm not sure if they have or not, but yeah, I would definitely like to follow up with them.
Wonderful. Okay. There's just a couple more questions. I see one from Alyssa Hogan who's asking, what do you mean by mitigating evidence when you're talking about applicants to housing? Would that mean documentation or just having a conversation with them? What could that look like?
Yeah, it could really range. So it could be, letters from a person's employer saying that, they're a great worker and they're on time, et cetera. It can be letters of recommendation from members of the community, or if the person is under community supervision, maybe that parole officer. I myself, I'm formerly incarcerated, and when I first applied for an apartment on my own in New York City, my criminal history was flagged, and but the broker or the real estate agent gave me a chance to submit documentations to really support my application. So I remember putting this like 54-page packet together, right? That included like my transcripts and like letter of recommendations from like my employers, and like I think I even threw like a thesis that I got an A for or something like that in there, right? So that's the kind of things in terms of mitigating evidence. But then some housing providers I know, in addition to that, they often interview a person one-on-one. So that could just, yeah.
So it's sort of like any sort of evidence or information that could help the landlord take this whole of person approach and individualized review of the applicant.
Exactly, yes.
See if we have any other questions. I don't see any, but I want to really thank you for joining us today. I know that you're en route to an airplane right now, so I thank you for trying to find a quiet place in the airport to join us. And we hope we'll see you soon when HUD releases its proposed rules, so that we can learn more about how everybody can be submitting comments in support of opening up access to housing.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
We're now going to go on to our next set of speakers, Kayla Gilchrist and Jennifer Casaleon from Community Change. They're going to tell us a little bit about some of their work that they've been doing, including a grassroots housing justice tour, a sign-on letter, and a toolkit. Welcome, both of you guys. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hey, y'all. My name is Kayla Gilchrist. As you can see, I'm an organizer on the Housing Justice team at Community Change. If y'all are not familiar with Community Change, we're a national organization based in DC, but for upwards of 50 years, we've been focused on building the power of low-income people, especially Black, Brown, and other people of color, and immigrants to fight for a society where everyone can thrive. And so there are additional issues that we work with grassroots leaders on, in addition to housing, like childcare, but we'll focus on the housing piece, of course, for today. So I wanted to just start with a little bit of an overview to level set what it is that we've been doing with partners on the ground. And so our team at Community Change has been working with 6 core partners in Michigan, Washington, Oregon, California, Louisiana, of course, leaders and staff in DC as well. And I'm missing someone. I'll come back to that. But for now, upwards of 2 years, nearly, we started with a training that we did with leaders in August of 2021. And as part of that training, we met with HUD officials around a variety of issues pertaining to the leaders and their direct lived experience, but also just centering how important it is for HUD to be engaging more and in more robust ways with those directly impacted on a regular basis, right? And in ways that are equitable. And after that, the leaders that were present decided that they wanted to launch a larger campaign focused on the core pieces, core things that they were experiencing as problems to then bring to HUD decision makers around policies that would impact their daily lived experience. And so as this campaign has progressed, the leaders started to cut an issue and specifically focused on 3 things: landlord accountability, housing for those at the lowest incomes, as well as the decriminalization of those experiencing homelessness, which we just heard a little bit about from our colleague, John. And all of those based in centering racial and gender justice and equity as well. So as they've developed this campaign, as a piece of that campaign and as to draw attention to what leaders are pushing for change, we have embarked on a 3-city housing justice tour. We're smack dab in the middle of it. We've hit stop 1 and 2, and we are headed, both Jennifer and I, as well as others on our team, are headed to Akron, Ohio, tomorrow, actually. But the purpose of this tour was really threefold. Number one, that it was completely led by leaders, directly impacted leaders, namely residents of HUD subsidized housing, and was focused both on organizing skills, right? On leadership development for those in local communities that are doing this work. It was to elevate our policy asks, which Jennifer will share a little bit more about in a moment, and really to push for narrative change, both in our local communities, on this national stage with the media, and so on and so forth. And so, as I said, we started a couple of weeks ago. So our first stop was Lafayette, Louisiana. Last week, we were in Cottage Grove, Oregon, and this week we're headed to Akron, Ohio. And each tour stop has looked pretty similar in that directly impacted leaders gathered. We did kind of an organizing 101 training the first night, and that next day we were also then joined by HUD officials from the HUD headquarters, as well as the regional offices, along with other local decision makers that the local leaders wanted to engage. And we went on an actual tour of people's homes, of different organizations that are meeting the direct service needs of local communities. But leaders opened their homes to show their their organizing colleagues as well as HUD officials and other officials what they're actually trying to survive in many cases, right? Conditions that they're trying, that them and their families are trying to survive. And focusing on those three core issues, right? How people who are experiencing homelessness in their local communities are being criminalized currently, focusing on how landlords are very often not held accountable for safe conditions for their homes, that there's not enough housing, and this overarching piece about how tenants need HUD to more deeply invest in tenant organizing in order to meet some of those same needs from a local perspective. So we visited people's homes, like I said, along with a variety of different sites. We also lifted up where there were opportunities, right? Where some really great stuff is happening, and other best practices that can be expanded or duplicated in other areas. And then we also had a panel led by those directly impacted in each community to share with those present both their experience of the tour as well as why it's so necessary that the policy goals that Jennifer is going to talk about are acted on as quickly as possible. So as we go through that same thing in Akron this week, we're then going to be concluding in DC on the week of May 8th. So May 9th through the 11th, we'll have between 50 and 60 grassroots leaders, directly impacted people coming to DC to work together. We'll be meeting with Secretary Fudge, along with having a variety of other activities throughout the day, opportunities to engage media and elevate these issues, et cetera, and what the policies are that we're pushing for. And we're really excited. It's been such a powerful experience to see leaders centered in this way, as they should be, directly impacted people centered. And we're excited to also present the policy goals to Secretary Fudge and other decision makers at HUD. So I'll kick it to Jennifer to add anything else on that, as well as review the policies.
Thank you so much, Kayla. So I'm going to overview the three core goals of the Housing Justice Tour that Kayla mentioned. And those are essentially care, health, and organizing. Care for people experiencing homelessness, health in all HUD subsidized units, health and safety standards, upholding those, and uplifting, organizing, and extending that right. All of this with an emphasis on racial justice and increasing access for people at the lowest incomes. So for the first goal, which is around urging local jurisdictions to treat people experiencing homelessness with care, we would like Secretary Fudge to make a strong statement addressing the steps that the agency will take to incorporate language against criminalization into a range of different communication. This includes HUD guidance, FAQs, grant competitions, and the House America efforts that the agency is currently undergoing. We believe that a core part of ending homelessness also ensures that people who are currently unhoused aren't punished or targeted for acts of survival for trying to shelter in public spaces. Another part of the first goal is that we want HUD to undertake a review of its competitive grant process to state and local governments to incorporate a scoring rubric that provides meaningful weight to places that are already offering concrete evidence of implementing best practices, of not using arrest as a response to homelessness, providing services, meeting people where they are at, and providing mental health accessibility to folks who are unhoused. And so, like many people on this call, we want to uplift care of people who are experiencing homelessness instead of further criminalizing and punishing people who have faced homelessness because of our lack of affordable housing and our housing system that has not prioritizing housing for all. The second goal is around ensuring that landlords who are participating in federal subsidy programs remain in compliance with health and safety standards. And so A few areas that we want HUD to focus on include improving its oversight of its Office of Public and Indian Housing, along with the Office of Multifamily Housing and all the PHAs across the country, to make sure that all landlords are accountable to the agreements that they sign with HUD and with tenants. This is paramount, we believe. When landlords are unable to make repairs within the allotted correction timeframes, we believe that HUD should include in its housing assistant payment contract a statement about the landlord's responsibility to provide temporary accommodations to the list of possible remedies. We also want HUD to improve its system and databases of tracking complaints across all of its 10 regions. And we believe this is necessary for more efficient tracking. We were happy to see that HUD did request funds to create a tenant tracking system complaint under its Office of Multifamily Housing in its FY24 funding request. We would like HUD to, of course, make sure that any tenant tracking complaint is subsequently also tracking the landlords tied to those complaints. And as a last resort, we'd love for HUD to improve its process of course, when necessary, ending ties with landlords through the processes that already has in place, including suspension or debarment when there are repeated failures to maintain healthy living conditions for families who receive a subsidy. The third goal is around providing additional support and resources for HUD subsidized tenants to organize. We believe that organizing is a great mechanism for improving housing communities. So one of our asks is around creating a Department of Tenant Rights to be a hub of educational and technical assistance and resources. We want HUD to meaningfully incorporate tenants in policymaking and to provide support for the development of tenant councils and to have ongoing best practices, resources, and educational resources available for HUD tenants and grantees. We believe that HUD should exercise its power every year to request from Congress $10 million annually to fund tenant groups. And this, of course, as many of you know, is part of Section 514 funding of MARA, or the Multifamily Assisted Housing Reform and Affordability Act of 1987. And last but not least, we want, like many groups on this call, to extend tenants' right to organize without retaliation to all tenants in federally assisted housing, including families participating in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So if you are interested in signing on to a policy goals letter to the Secretary before we meet with her in DC on May 10th, that outlines all of these goals, please reach out to me or Kayla. And please also share on social media, as we are in Akron or in DC, the need to uphold these policies that have been led by people with direct lived experience, people who experience homelessness, people who live in public housing, and who are frankly demanding better for their families and for their communities. So happy to answer any questions there might be, but overall, thank you for your work and thank you for helping us uplift these policy goals.
Thank you, Jennifer and Kayla. It's such an exciting tour, and I'm really glad to see that this is really led by people with lived experience. I know a lot of us in this field recognize that that's an important place for our industry to move to, but it's really good to see you guys putting that into practice. My first question is about, do you have any tips for how organizations can genuinely engage people with lived experience without them feeling like they're being tokenized? What are some tips that you might have for those of us who want to incorporate that more into our policy work?
Thanks, Sarah, for that question. And I mentioned this earlier, but this, the tour, the policy goals, all of it was developed from leaders from upwards of a dozen states, right? Working together, including Ohio, which was the state I failed to mention earlier. But this was done in solidarity, right? And as a demonstration that issues are national and systemic, not individual, right? And they're all things that HUD can act on administratively. And I mean, I think one to state the obvious to your question, one piece of this campaign and why it so deeply engaged leaders was that the whole thing was led by leaders, right? Based in relationships of mutual trust, where we have been working with local grassroots organizations for many years, some newer, right? Some for over 8 or 9 years. And so ongoing relationship is, I think, the best place that any organizer or anybody engaging with those with direct lived experience can kind of put our cap on, right? And so ongoing work, not necessarily just a single event or when there's an event or something like that, but how can people be not only at the table, but making the menu, right? Every step of the way, I think, is a place to really start. And I'll just ask Jennifer if you want to add anything to that as well.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Kayla. I would agree that it needs to not be a one-time event and something that is an ongoing conversation. And it's also asking folks with lived experience not only to share their story, but also the solutions that they have for policy change and how they'd like to be part of that policy change, including implementation. And so, yeah, absolutely uplifting all the parts that Kayla mentioned. But, we see organizing as a key part of strengthening our housing system. So we'll continue to uplift that and appreciate the support.
Wonderful. And if people want to be able to join you on the tour, is that possible for people who are located in Akron or in DC? Is there a public part to the tour or to the event that they can join?
Yes, so I actually just dropped the social media toolkit, which has the RSVP links to the town halls. And so, for instance, I could drop here the Ohio Town Hall, which is happening on Thursday, April 27th. And so that is open to the public. It's closed to press, but it is open to the public. And so folks are able to join. We'll also be having a press conference in DC on May 10th. And so if you're interested, please reach out to Kayla or I, and we can share more information as we know it, for standing in solidarity with leaders who've been, as Kayla mentioned, for almost 2 years, pushing these policy goals and bravely sharing their stories with the goal of bold policy change.
Well, we applaud you, and we are looking forward to your event here in DC. I know someone from NLIT will be sure to attend as well. But I want to thank both of you guys for joining, and hopefully we can hear back from you soon about what your plans are for moving this policy agenda forward after your meetings with the HUD Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Sarah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We're now going to hear from some field updates. First up is Kathy Alderman from Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. Thanks for joining, Kathy.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me, an LIHC community. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about a report that we just released, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, called Colorado's Affordable Housing Crisis. It's Time for Strategic Investments. And I want to talk a little bit about why we felt it was necessary to release this report. We've seen a kind of an alarming trend recently in using public funds for middle income and higher income households housing. And we know that that really to get the biggest bang for our buck on public funds, we need to be investing for those mid to low income and people on fixed and very low incomes. And so we wanted to put together this report to really make the case for that. And so the report, and I'm sure we're going to provide a link to it, really talks about the state of homelessness and housing in Colorado, how housing affordability is defined, because people don't often, fully understand what AMI means unless you really kind of dig deep. Why we're kind of in the housing crisis that we're in because of federal disinvestment. Then this trend that I've been talking about and how we need to really combat this idea of trickle-down housing, how we need to really think about our specific populations of people experiencing homelessness and those on fixed incomes, and then some kind of guiding principles that we would encourage elected officials to look at and utilize when they're making decisions about public funds and resources. I want to encourage everyone that to feel free to use this report. I mean, while the data is specific to Colorado, I'm sure people could plug and play their own state data into it. And, you know, we've already done the research on why trickle-down housing doesn't work. And so we would encourage folks to feel free to use that. Next slide. So we really start out by explaining the crisis of homelessness in Colorado, recognizing that currently there's anywhere between 10 and 53,000 people experiencing homelessness. And why there's so much variability in this data is because we know that the point in time is an undercount. It's a single night in January. And then we have other data sources, including Department of Ed data, including HMIS, or Homelessness Management Information System data, and including the number of people who are using Medicaid as their health insurance throughout the year of 2019. And so that's how we got to this number. And this number has been going up every single year. Next slide. And then we really want people to understand what we're talking about when we talk about households at different income levels. And so we go into explaining that. We use a lot of NLHC data to do that. But then we also go through and kind of explain what it means to live at certain levels of area median income. Next slide. And so you can see here in Colorado, we characterize our counties by rural resort because of our the ski industry and mountain industry, and then urban areas. And so we thought it was really important to show what it looks like for a household in a rural county, which is Bent County on this slide, an urban county, which is Denver County, and a rural resort county. And to show the slight variability that area median income has for households, so that when we're thinking about building housing in these distinct areas, we're really looking at what households can afford and not just targeting specifically to what we think area median income indicates. So next slide. And we also go into a discussion about cost burden and how, you know, most of the cost burden is felt, you know, across the spectrum of incomes, but it's really felt at households that are living, you know, mid-income, low-income, and extremely low-income, because the less you make, the more housing costs that you pay means you have less money for, you know, those essential items like healthy food, healthcare, education costs, transportation, et cetera. And that's really borne out by those households that are living on the lowest income. And so we have to, when we're trying to solve for cost burden, we really have to target our solutions and our interventions for those households that are essentially under the weight of the greatest burden. Next slide. And then, you know, we have to talk about the housing crisis as impacting people across income spectrums, because it's true. I mean, we know that there are lots of middle and high income families that can't afford to sell their home and buy a new one, that may not be able to get out of the rental situation because there's no new first-time home ownership opportunities available. But it's also really important to make sure that we're describing the housing crisis accurately. And so in Colorado, for people, and this is also NLHC data that we just put into this neat little visual, for households that are living at 100% area median income or above, for every 100 home that's needed, there's 102 available. So there's actually a little bit of choice for folks at that income level. However, for people living at 30% of AMI and below, there's only 26 units for every 100 needed. So that leaves, you know, 3/4 of the population of folks living at lower area median income levels without an option for housing. And it leads to some pretty disastrous effects on the rest of the housing market. Next slide. And one of those is this concept of renting up and renting down. And so for somebody who's making, you know, $2,200 a month, they could actually afford something, you know, probably at $1,800 or $2,000 a month. However, they're oftentimes renting down. So they're renting units of housing that, you know, to spend less money. I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate way to budget and to think about making money, but it just means that people at higher incomes are really filling up houses and homes that should be available to people at lower incomes, which then forces households at lower incomes to rent up, meaning that they're spending much more of their income on rent because they're not able to find housing that really, you know, meets their income level. Next slide. And then, you know, we know that the housing crisis has, you know, perpetuated over the last, you know, 10, 15 years. And it's really because the federal government hasn't kept up with its investments in low-income housing and middle-income housing. And, you know, as the state of Colorado, we really just started making investments in 2019, which I'll discuss in a minute. And we had to do that because the federal disinvestment has been so great. And so we, you know, especially as we face votes in Congress today or this week on how, you know, how to get around the debt ceiling and how to start looking at our budget, we can't continue to cut back on these critical services if we think we're ever going to solve the housing and homelessness crises. Next slide. As I mentioned, in Colorado, we were investing around $9 million until about 2017. And then we actually got an investment in some housing voucher programs at about $15 million. In 2019, we finally got 2 sustainable sources of funding. One's a one-time 3-year funding source that hasn't yet taken effect. And then another one is an ongoing fee that is charged against vendors that will bring in nearly $45 million a year, but we haven't invested for so long that our housing crisis is acute. And so these funds hardly will have a chance to catch up with the crisis that we have. We've also seen huge investments, as I know many of the other states on this call have, from the American Rescue Plan Act funds or ARPA dollars. But all of these are one-time investments and they must be spent by 2026, which isn't really a lot of time and frankly isn't is the biggest investment we've ever seen, but isn't enough really to address the crises. And so just recently, voters passed a measure to provide sustainable funding for housing at the tune of about $300 million a year. And this is through kind of Colorado's strange taxpayer bill of rights, where we're just not going to refund certain taxes that have been paid back to voters. And this is one reason why this report is so critically important at this time, because the voters approved using these resources for middle and low income households. And there's been an effort to change the voters' intent by raising those area median incomes and allowing for these funds to be used for higher income households. And so we really thought it was time to lay out the case and make the case for why we need to both respect the will of the voters, but also continue to make investments to middle and low income households where the need is the greatest. Next slide. And then, of course, we can't talk about the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis without talking about the equity issues, recognizing, of course, that communities of color are overrepresented both in the homelessness population as well as those that are living with extreme housing insecurity. We know that we have, over 62,000 low-income renters that are living with disabilities, and so likely will remain on a fixed income, for a lifetime, and those housing needs are very critical. We have an aging population. Frankly, the population of people experiencing homelessness is aging. Seniors who have already, spent time working, who are living on fixed income, are losing their homes and not being able to find another place to live. We discuss the specific issues around veterans housing and how, veterans oftentimes have a very difficult time finding housing that they can stay in for some of the reasons that that our previous speakers mentioned today. And we know that people experiencing homelessness and people on low and fixed incomes, are working when they can, but they're all working, unfortunately, for wages that have not kept up with the cost of housing. Next slide, please. And so we're also having this conversation in Colorado, and I know that many other states are as well, about upzoning and requiring more density in housing, meaning that instead of just having single family homes, we have quadplexes and triplexes and larger apartment buildings. And we believe that is a strategy for producing more housing. However, that strategy must be accompanied with affordability requirements, because if it's not, then we're just going to have more housing that's still not affordable to everyone. And this really gets at the heart of that trickle-down housing idea. So a lot of people argue that housing, like any other commodity, is just something we need to have more supply of. And if we just have more housing, then everybody will benefit. And that simply just isn't true for housing. And I'm going to just tell you why on the next slide. But I also want to raise that other things that we have to think about when we think about upzoning and requiring more density or allowing more density is that can have a huge impact on current communities in terms of displacement and gentrification. And so in addition to making sure upzoning is aligned with affordability principles, we also have to make sure that there are displacement mitigation factors or measures in place. Next slide. So why doesn't trickle-down housing work? Well, housing isn't like cars and widgets, right? Where you choose to live has a lot to do with your job, with where you want to be, what schools you want to go to, what amenities you need to be connected to. And that's just not true for other commodities. We also know that housing demand is not constant, right? So on any given day, you can have different households falling in and out of the cycle of homelessness, moving across the country for new jobs. So it's just not the same as the need for other types of commodities in the market. We know that, unfortunately, corporately owned apartment or rental units are often sitting empty. In fact, there was a report in Denver that there's 23,000 units of market rate or luxury units sitting empty in Denver today because there's no incentive for them to lower their rents and make them available to the households that need them. And so you have to kind of take that into account, is that in some instances, there may be housing available, but just not accessible to individuals on moderate and low incomes. And then we also have to consider that there are some impacts to more supply, and eventually housing can potentially trickle down to maybe middle income households, often not low income housing households, but that happens after about 20 years. And by that time, the quality of the housing is likely deteriorated. And so we're not necessarily moving people on low and moderate incomes into quality housing. Next slide. So just, we issued this report. We've had pretty great news coverage of it. These are active links. So when the slideshow is sent around, you're welcome to take a look at these. So just today, NLHC did a blog on this report. We're using it for advocacy efforts, and we would encourage anyone else on this call who would like to use it to feel free to. Next slide, please. And so what are we saying? What are our call to action for this report is that when we have public funds and resources, we have to direct it to increasing affordable housing for those who have suffered the most significant barriers in accessing housing and for those on the lowest income. We need to prioritize mixed income development, both from a community building standpoint, but as well as when we're looking at density and upzoning, so that we are really making sure that we're balancing out middle and high income housing with middle to low income housing. We also really want data to drive the kind of housing that's needed. We just presented a bunch of data. NLHC is so great about keeping data in our hands. And we can't build housing for the conversations that happen in grocery store parking lots. We have to build housing based on housing needs assessments that tell you where those greatest needs are. And then all permissions and allowances for local communities to increase density, to upzone, to build more housing must be tied to affordability, anti-displacement measures, and accessibility requirements. So that is the basis of our report. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm also, like I said, happy to share this report and let folks use it if it's helpful for them in their advocacy work.
Thank you, Kathy. When I was listening to this report back from you, I was like, so heartened that you are our state partner, because this speaks to me in such a deep way. I would love to encourage everybody who's on this call to take a look at this report and to think about doing something similar for your community as well, because I know that, at least in my conversations with elected officials, whether at the federal level or state and local level, there's a real misunderstanding of who's most impacted by the housing crisis and what the solutions are. And I'm wondering if you've had any sort of reactions to the report so far that you can share with us. Like when you're talking to elected officials, is there a place where it's sort of the light bulb goes off and they better understand what the issues are?
You know, I think in some of the media coverage, you know, some of the reporters that I've spoken to about the report, I think they haven't necessarily thought about the fact that this really is a conversation about public resources, right? And so we're not trying to say that there's not a housing crisis for a lot of people across the income spectrum. But what we're saying is that public resources are limited, and the market can actually solve for middle and high income housing issues. And the market has a lot more access to financial resources to build. And those households have a lot more access to financial resources to move and to get into different kinds of housing. But for these lower income households and for these types of developments that rely solely on low income housing tax credits, which are very competitive, or, you know, philanthropic funding, we really need to target our public resources to lifting up those projects to make sure that everyone has access to housing, even if they're you know, making on a fixed income or they're at a very low income. And I think when we start talking about that, it is a little bit of a light bulb because I think I've heard some reporters say and some of our elected officials say, well, the people in my community that I hear from, you know, are nurses and, you know, lawyers whose kids can't move back to their community. And I always say, well, and they have the luxury of being able to advocate with you because they have time and access to resources. And these other households are on the front lines. They are working 2 and 3 jobs sometimes. They're trying to manage households, you know, unsafe living conditions, and they don't have time to advocate, which is why we also really advocate for using a data-centered approach to identifying your housing needs.
100%. And I think usually when I'm talking to elected officials, when they see that 1% of middle income households are paying more than half of their income on rent, but they hear a lot from middle income renters, that disconnect, I think, becomes more clear. And I think it helps reorient people to focus on those with the greatest needs. So I want to thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Kathy. We'll talk to you soon.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me today.
Absolutely. And we're going to turn to our next speaker, Joanna Carr from the Arizona Housing Coalition. Hey, Joanna.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I want to give a brief overview of what's happening in Arizona of now and a couple of things that we've been working on. So like with many places around our nation, our affordable housing crisis continues to deepen, and we're really continuing to feel the impacts of the pandemic as defined in significant increases in the number of households being affected by rent increases, rental bottlenecks, evictions, and of course, homelessness. Unsheltered homelessness has been on a continuous rise the last couple of years, and this is becoming a real critical issue in our higher populous areas like Phoenix, Tucson, and other metro areas where the problem is becoming more and more visible. Our rural communities too are significantly impacted, and affordability is an issue all across the state. Arizona is incredibly diverse in geography and community, and you know, although the affordable housing crisis runs deep across the state, the way that it's impacting communities is, you know, often looks different. So, for example, in our rural communities, you know, we're having more and more people moving into vast areas of forests, as an example, making our point in time counts quite difficult. I mean, that being said, despite the continuing issues that we're seeing, we have seen some really impressive programming coming through from the use of American Rescue Plan Act dollars, such as an increase in congregate sheltering options like hotels to homes and other models. And we have an incredible set of stakeholders in Arizona who continue to advocate for the resources that we need. We're incredibly concerned about funding cliffs, and so on a state level, we continue to advocate for state funding. Cuts to the federal budget will have a significant detrimental impact on an already stressed system, and so that's an issue that we're really advocating for, with our partners at the federal level. So that being said, we did attend Capitol Hill Day back in March, and we met with 5 of our representatives and 1 senator, and we're able to hold some virtual meetings too, and really make those connections. And one thing that we've really tried to leverage in Arizona in our advocacy over the last couple of years is bringing storytelling to advocacy. So we were able to bring stories per district, depending on what we're seeing. So for example, for Coconino County, we're able to talk specifically about, there's a case of a teacher living in her car in the forest, not a standalone case, and things like in Yavapai County, residents, seeing that they're not being able to, get medical appointments quickly, or eat at a restaurant after a certain time because the workforce isn't able to live in the area. So we're really trying to hone in on our stories depending on the particular district. We are hoping to continue that and strengthen that. One thing that we did notice kind of on our recent visit to DC, including at the National Low Income Housing Conference, is that Arizona doesn't have as strong a tenant advocate voice in comparison to other states. So we're really inspired by the states who are, really have that incredible lived experience and voice coming into advocacy. And so we're working on trying to increase that through our lived experience councils here in Arizona, and spinning some ideas on how we can bring people with lived experience to Capitol Hill next year. Also, in terms of other activities, as mentioned, like a real focus on storytelling, we had our annual conference in Arizona back in the end of February, beginning of March, and we had a component on telling story from the field, so focused on individuals working in direct services with their own lived experiences. We worked with a media channel to create some videos to tell the story, and that was incredibly powerful. We're also building relationships with the art community. We had an art component at the conference with a activity, but also inviting artists to tell their story through a piece. Again, that was really powerful, and we hope to continue that. We have a veterans event coming up next week, our largest stand-down event and resource event, where again, we're bringing the arts community in as a component to storytelling from the veteran community. And continuing to use social media as a way to provide engaging content for advocacy. So we're going to be expanding all of this and trying to, continue to build on storytelling and advocacy throughout the next year and beyond. So that's a very brief update from Arizona.
Thanks, Joanna. And I think folks are going to be interested because we're going to circle back to this question about using the arts and being creative and how we can use it in our advocacy later on today's call. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Okay. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box, but thank you for joining, Joanna.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Awesome. So now we're going to move on to our policy update. First thing, there's so much going on this week. First, Diane is testifying, our CEO is testifying Wednesday before the Senate Banking Committee on a hearing called Building Consensus to Address Housing Challenges. If you want to check out the hearing and watch it while it happens, I'm going to share a link in the chat box with everyone. There we go. Check it out. It's going to be exciting. I know that Diane's going to be focusing on important bipartisan legislation, including bipartisan legislation that's been endorsed by this campaign, the House campaign, as well as our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, which is a multi-sector campaign that's focused on bringing together advocates from across different sectors to push for housing resources for people with the lowest incomes. And I know that in particular, she's going to call out the need for Congress to pass two major bills. One is the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, which we expect will be reintroduced any day now. This is a bill that would provide 250,000 more families with young children with a housing voucher, as well as mobility counseling, so they can move to communities of their choice, including neighborhoods that have high-performing schools and good quality early education programs. We're also, Diane in her testimony is going to highlight the Eviction Crisis Act, again, another bipartisan bill, this time from Senator Young and Bennett, which would build on all the success from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program during the pandemic to create a permanent resource to provide emergency rental assistance going forward. So check out the hearing and see the questions that members of Congress ask Diane and others. Other witnesses for the hearing include Lou Tisler from National Neighbor Works Association and Vanessa Brown Calder, who's from the Cato Institute. So it should be fun. Here's where things get dicier this week. Also, this week, we're expecting Speaker McCarthy is going to hold a vote on their harmful proposal to lift the federal debt ceiling in exchange for very, very deep cuts to domestic programs, including HUD and USDA's affordable housing and homelessness programs. We hear that the House Rules Committee is going to mark up the bill on Tuesday in the late afternoon, meaning that the bill could reach the House floor as early as Wednesday. And it's critically important that advocates on this call their members of Congress, contact them, and tell them to vote against this harmful proposal. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. What we know is that Speaker McCarthy does not yet have all of the votes from his Republican caucus to pass this bill. They're still trying to whip up the votes. So now is a really great time for you to be calling your members of Congress, including both Democrats and Republicans. So a little bit more about the proposal. It's called the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. It's a bill that would lift the debt ceiling for 1 year in exchange for 10 years of very deep spending cuts. So the first thing it does is that it caps funding for this year at FY22 spending levels. But by exempting defense programs and veteran health programs, it means that could be about a 23% cut to all other domestic programs, including a 23% cut, at least for HUD, homelessness and housing programs. It would also limit for 10 years funding increases to just 1% each year. It would rescind any unobligated COVID relief fund dollars, meaning unobligated state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars or home ARPA dollars, or other funds. It would put in place rigid work requirements that are often counterproductive and ineffective, and it would apply those to anti-poverty programs, including SNAP and Medicaid. And we know that if all of these policies were to move forward, it would make it really impossible for communities to prevent mass evictions from taking place. HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge put out a statement outlining what would happen if the budget was cut this dramatically. And she estimates that nearly 1 million people who are currently being served by HUD's rental assistance programs could lose access to their assistance, which means that they would be at a very high risk of facing housing instability and evictions. And about 120,000 fewer people who are experiencing homelessness would be able to receive services. So it's really dramatic, the level of cuts that we're seeing. And that would just be for year one. Of course, I mentioned that there are spending caps going forward. And so the harm would be ongoing. So why are we focused on this so much? I don't think this bill is going to pass in the Senate. So the real harm here is that if it passes the House, it gives Republicans more leverage in the negotiations over how and whether to lift the debt ceiling and about spending cuts overall. And we're already starting to see some moderate Democrats starting to argue that it's time for both sides to sit down and start these negotiations. And they're sort of signaling that they're willing to engage in conversations around deep budget cuts. So it's really important that you use today and tomorrow and Wednesday to call your members of Congress, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, and to tell them that it's unacceptable to to lift the debt ceiling in exchange for these deep spending cuts. And that now, really, as we're seeing rents increase, as we're seeing eviction filings going up, as we're seeing homelessness increase in many communities, now is really the time where Congress should be investing more money into affordable housing, not less. So I want to encourage you to make those phone calls as soon as possible. There's other things that you can be doing between now and Wednesday and beyond. One is you could sign your organization onto our national letter. It's a letter from the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding that is urging Congress to reject any spending cuts and to instead fund housing programs and homelessness programs at the highest level possible. I'm going to ask my colleagues if they can share in the chat box, thank you so much, a link to that letter. We have about 2,000 groups that have signed on. If you haven't, please make sure you sign on and share it with your networks. The second thing you can do, we have a link that you can use to email your members of Congress. Again, a very simple way for you to tell them to increase funding, not cut resources for affordable housing. And then third, I want you to encourage you to use our advocacy toolkit. Again, I'll ask my colleagues to share that link to that toolkit in the chat box, but it has talking points that you can use, sample social media messages that you can use, sample op-eds that you can use to really start engaging and putting the pressure on Congress to push back against these deep spending cuts. So I'm going to pause there, see if there's any questions in the Q&A box. I don't see anything just yet. I do see one question, sorry, about how could the Republican Study Committee budget proposal also affect negotiations? How I could see that playing out is it would put pressure on Speaker McCarthy, not just to push forward on these cuts, but to go even further, right? We know that there are certainly some very conservative members of Congress who don't think that this terrible bill goes even far enough. So we need to be counteracting that pressure, and to, especially for moderate Republicans and Democrats, put pressure on them to make sure that they know that people in their community oppose these deep budget cuts. So I'm going to pause there. Now that you sort of know the federal landscape, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brooke Shipwright, who can talk to you about not just what you can do this week, that's what I mentioned today, but what you can be doing to plan for advocacy going forward. Hey, Brooke.
Thanks, Sarah. And hey, everyone, it's so great to be with you all this afternoon. Like Sarah said, it's a really important week for our advocacy with the House budget cut proposal, and our continued advocacy will be needed in May. May will be another key moment for negotiations, which means another key moment for your advocacy. So I'm here today to invite you all to participate in a big advocacy push we're hosting May 8th through 19th to speak out against the possible budget cuts that Sarah was talking about in the federal budget. And you won't want to miss it because it's going to be fun and something completely new for us. We're calling it Spring into Action and are inviting advocates to creatively express the importance of federal housing and homelessness resources and what potential cuts would mean to them and their communities. Similarly to what Joanna from Arizona shared a little bit ago about sharing stories through art. So in addition to our typical advocacy activities like emails and phone calls, we're encouraging you all to get creative, like writing a haiku or other short poem, creating a visual art piece, or recording a video telling your story, tying in the importance of federal housing and homelessness assistance. You can share your activities with members of Congress May 8th through 19th by tagging them on social media and using the hashtag #CutsHurt. That's really important that we, post on social media and tag them and tie that common thread to hashtag #CutsHurt throughout so that they hear the importance of this across the country. You can also send them directly to their congressional offices through email too. So what you can be doing right now to prepare is to think about how you want to participate and start creating. Maybe you already like to paint or are a poet, or maybe you want to try something new. It's totally fine, whichever, how creative or not creative you feel you are, you can totally participate in this. So start thinking about how you want to participate and start creating. Like Sarah mentioned, our toolkit is a great place to start for talking points, and you can feel free to reach out to us on the field team. I'll drop our main email address in the chat. You can also reach out to your organizer directly that covers your state with questions, and I will drop a link to our map of the organizers. And that's about it. So we hope you'll participate. Again, those dates are May 8th through 19th. So I'll turn it back to Sarah to close things out.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke, so much. I hope you're getting from us the sense of urgency around these budget cuts. This is certainly the very top legislative threat that we see this year. And I know that many of you guys were around in 2011 when Congress passed the Budget Control Act, which led to 10 years of spending caps. What we saw then was that it really prevented Congress from funding housing and homelessness programs at anywhere near the level, and we just can't afford to have that level of cuts again, or even deeper going forward. So just as a reminder, this week you'll want to call your members of Congress and tell them to vote no on the, let me bring up the name of that bill one more time, the Limit, Save, and Cut housing bill. You'll just tell them the Republican budget proposal. You want to tell them to vote no against that, and then start planning now for May 8th to May 19th for spring into action, and get out your creative juices so that you can participate in a new, cool way. And so with that, we're going to end today's call. Thank you guys so much for joining, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Take care, everybody.